On today's episode of the NASM CPT Podcast with me, Rick Richey, I explore the biomechanics of squats and how some positions influence muscles. Now, there are different positions of the torso during squat, aka the tibia-torso angle. So if the tibia goes forward more than the torso, if the torso goes forward more than the tibia, or if they're neutral, what does that mean based on research that we're going to look into? Also, based on research, what does our feet position look like? So if our feet are straight ahead or if our feet turn out, what does that mean for me and what does that mean for my muscles? And does the range of motion have any effect on my squat outcomes? All right, so make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and share with your fitness friends and family, and leave a 5-star review if you get an opportunity. It does help us at the podcast. Now, here's the episode: Squat Biomechanics and the Influences on Muscles.
You're listening to the NASM CPT Podcast with Rick Richey, winner of the Sharecare Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey, y'all, and welcome to the NASM CPT Podcast. My name is Rick Richey, and today I want to talk about squatting and squat biomechanics, but I also want to clear something up. We get this a lot, so I want to say that the setup for the overhead squat assessment is not necessarily how you do squats. So what we're looking at here, if I set up a squat assessment and I put your feet straight ahead, hip to shoulder width apart, and we do squats in that position, what that does is allows me to keep the feet straight ahead, and it gives me information about how much dorsiflexion you have at the foot and ankle complex. It allows me to understand a little bit more about the range of motion that you have. But does that mean that that's the right way to squat? No, not necessarily, right? We've got a lot of different opportunities and variability when it comes to squat and how we squat. There are also some things that I'm going to say that historically NASM has been very strict on, and we, through the evidence that has been presented, have lightened up on that. And fortunately, I'm going to speak about these things today so we can talk about, okay, what does it mean when we squat and we have a forward lean? And what does it mean when we squat and our knees bend a little bit more? And what does it mean if my feet turn out? And is that okay? And the answer is yes, it is okay. And just because how we do a setup for an overhead squat assessment is a certain way, that's because that's how assessments are done. They are done a specific certain way. But what about squats themselves? Well, that we get to explore a little bit together. And we're going to go through a little bit of evidence and discuss what different squat positions might look like and what effect they have on muscles. So I think it's important to discuss this and also to really lay the groundwork that I know a lot of y'all are like, oh, NASM is very strict on the squats. And for a long time, we have been. And through evidence and time, we are now looking at, there are a lot of different ways to squat, and we can show the effects on muscle. And also, we don't show that there is any indication that certain ways of squatting is better, or doing something outside of that is actually more disadvantaged or more susceptible to injury. So let us move forward. Onward and upward, my friends. Let us do this. So let's discuss this. There's a study that was done in 2011 by Barak et al. And this is a statement from it. Here's the statement. Love this statement. Here we go. The relative demand of hip and knee extensors during squatting could be predicted based on the relative inclination of the trunk and the tibia. So what extensors are there? Well, the glutes primarily for hip extension and the quads primarily for knee extension. So those are the extensors during the squatting. And what demand is placed on those can be predicted based off the inclination of the trunk and the tibia. Now, NASM also historically there's a tibia-torso angle. There is, and they like to keep them parallel. So if your tibia goes forward 20 degrees, then your torso should go forward 20 degrees. And there is a reason for that. And based on this research, we'll discuss what that reason is. But if the tibia goes forward more than the trunk, we can identify which muscles will be worked more. And if the tibia leans forward more than the tibia, if the trunk leans forward more than the tibia does relatively, then they can identify which muscles relatively are going to be working more. Now, it's probably not a big surprise to you, but to have some research that backs it here, I think it's pretty important. So here's what the author says. Based on the findings of Barak et al., it is possible to characterize the relative demands of the hip and knee extensors using the trunk tibia inclination differences. When the degree of trunk inclination exceeds the degree of tibia inclination by 10%, a hip extensor bias can be inferred. Now, let me explain what that means. Let's go back to 20 degrees. When I go down into a squat, my tibia translates forward 20 degrees. And when I go into a squat, my torso matches that. It translates forward 20 degrees. But if it goes 30 degrees, if it's 10% more, if my torso leans forward 10% or more than my tibia does, then a hip extensor bias can be inferred, which means when doing a squat, if I lean forward more with my torso, then my hip extensors have to work more to lift me up. Shouldn't be a shock, but we now have data. We've got the research in here that supports it. So this is Barak et al. And we're also looking at Strab and Powers in 2024 and their article, Biomechanical Review of Squat Exercises, Implications for Clinical Practice in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy. So here's the following. It says when the degree of tibia inclination exceeds the degree of trunk inclination by 10%, a knee extensor bias squat can be inferred. What does that look like? Well, those are whom we might refer to as knee squatters, the ones where their torso is more upright, so they don't have a lot of torso forward lean, but their tibia leans forward a lot, which means they're squatting from their knees a lot more. Well, if you're squatting from your knees more and your torso is more upright, then which muscle is going to be working more? Clearly, we can look at this and say, yes, the quads are going to be working more. And I think one of the problems, too, is we'd look at it and we say, oh, it's really, really bad for your knees. And I would say it can be, but it's not. And it just depends. Because you could look at the same thing and say, well, if you lean forward a lot, then that could be bad for your back. And it can be, but it's not. So what does that mean? Well, I would say if you don't have a problem with your knees, then squatting with more inclination in the tibia shouldn't be that much of a problem. And the same thing that if I'm squatting and I have a more lean in my torso, if I don't have any issues in my SI joint or my back, then that excessive lean is not necessarily a bad thing because it's going to be more hip extensor work and certainly more spinal erector work isometrically in order for me to do that squat. So it's not that these squats are necessarily wrong, it's what the purpose of them are. But let's also look at something else. It says when those are relatively the same, so they're within 10% of each other. So I lean forward 20 degrees and I bend forward 20 degrees the other. When I do that, the relative demands on the hip and knee extensors can be considered equal, i.e. neutral bias, which means it is not biased more towards hip extensors or more towards my knee extensors. My quads and my glutes are working just as hard in a squat if my tibia and torso are within 10 degrees of each other when it comes to their translation forward. So that, again, that is Strab and Powers in 2024 and Barak et al. In 2011 in that research study. All right. This episode of the NASM CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM One, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients. Enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access to free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to nasm.org/membership to learn more about NASM One. All right. Well, let's look at these demands a little bit. So again, I've got my toe squatting, my knee squatting, more work on my quads. I got an excessive forward lean, more work on the backside. If my tibia-torso angle are relatively the same, within 10 degrees of each other, it is a neutral bias, or it's unbiased, which means just as much quad and just as much glute. But that's a lumbopelvic hip. So now let's look at something else. Let's look at foot position. And the foot position is something else that we talked about a lot at NASM, is keeping the feet straight ahead. Now, turning the toes out, keeping them straight ahead. There are a lot of people who squat in different ways. Most cues are now for the feet to be turned out, but why would that be? A lot of times it's because you're limited by your range of motion when your foot is straight ahead. So think about this. When we're doing squats and an overhead squat assessment, and I say, I want you to squat to chair depth and keep the torso relatively upright, and you do that, and it's really excessive forward lean, then I have you turn your feet out and go a little bit wider, and then you squat, and the torso can remain more upright. What happened? Well, it's the same thing as putting a heel lift underneath your heel. When you squat, you can still keep narrow. You can keep your feet straight ahead, but all of a sudden, your range of motion has incredibly improved. Why? Because it takes out the restriction of limited dorsiflexion. And that's also why some people have better looking squats when they have weight on their shoulders than when they're doing body weight squats, because the weight on their shoulders actually push them through some of the restrictions they have when they do their squats. So when people turn their feet out, it's not wrong, but then we get into another component where they go, well, if I turn my feet out, I'm going to preferentially work these muscles. And when we look at the research that Strab and Powers did in 2024, it looks like when let's go to this. Here's the quote. Toe out and external rotation in squats do not tend to have any greater increase in glute max or quad activation. And that one actually did surprise me a little bit, not from the quads, because turning the feet out doesn't change what's going on at the knee necessarily, but it certainly changes what's going on at the hip. And I thought it would be some increased glute activation from that. And it turns out, based on their research, that it does not. But it says it does increase frontal plane muscle activation, such as the adductors and the glute medius and minimus. So as the feet turn out, and you could probably see this, the feet turn out, but also as the feet get wider when we turn out, then that puts the adductors a bit more on stretch. And the adductors then have a preferential position to be activated to assist with the squat. First, through the means of adduction to help lift up higher, because obviously if my feet are straight ahead and my knees are straight ahead, then my adductors don't have any kind of adducting force in order to get up, because they are not abducted. But as my feet go wider and my toes turn out, then my adductors do have some additional implications to their activation. And the glute medius and minimus do as well. And I found that particular one interesting. Glute medius and minimus, a little more activation. Glute maximus, no significant activation increase by having the feet wider and the hips externally rotated. And I thought that was pretty interesting. But we now need to look at, there are other things to consider. My foot position is one, but now let's talk about squat depth. And here's the thing. In most research, most research tends to support increased muscle growth when it comes to increased squat depth. So the deeper you squat, the increase in muscle hypertrophy. However, it's mixed. The research mixed. So it's not exclusively hypertrophy. We don't see that it is hypertrophy across the boards and everybody who squats deeper has greater hypertrophy. Some research supports deeper squats having better sprinting outcomes, and some have shallow squats have there's some research that shows that it increases your height jump. That's fantastic. But when we look at the depth and we look at hypertrophy, it is still mixed, even though we lean towards increased range of motion looking like increased muscle hypertrophy. So what do we do with that information? Well, number one is I like the idea of trying to increase range of motion in people's squats. I get a lot of people who are quarter squatters where, I tell people, let's say overhead squat, I want you to squat as deep as you squat in order to get down to the toilet. And a lot of times that gets them into, a chair depth, toilet depth. But oftentimes I get people in and they can't squat any lower than a bar stool, which makes me question their restaurant decisions and what they're doing. But when they go down into their squat and they're limited, our job through the assessment process, try to identify what is impeding that range of motion. Sometimes it's the foot and ankle, a lot of times. And sometimes something's going on at the hip. Most of the times you're not going to see issues with the knee that limits that, but it could be pain. And if pain is the limitation, my job isn't to fix pain. That's a therapist's job. But can I increase range of motion without increasing the pain and avoiding pain? So I look at that. And so I'll look at things like foam rolling and stretching the calves, maybe addressing the quads a little bit in the foam rolling, especially at the rectus femoris. And then we're going to look at range of motion at the hip. There's also a femur length issue that goes with this kind of how far you lean forward, but it shouldn't change that I'm still looking for depth in a squat. I like the idea of parallel. I like my thigh to be parallel to the ground, because what's easy for me is that I can always look at the mid thigh and see if the mid thigh and the entire thigh, but through the middle of the thigh, not the top or the bottom of the thigh, is parallel to the ground. So it doesn't matter if you're 6'7", or if you're 5'9", or anything else, that your squat has a standard depth. What I'm not going to do based on this is say, well, you're never going to get bigger muscles if you don't get to that point, because we have some mixed evidence that shows there's just as much muscle hypertrophy in some studies as in the increased range of motion, but there are more studies that show increased range of motion gives me increased muscle hypertrophy. So I'm going to take that and not get upset if somebody can't. First of all, if it was conclusive and exclusive and it said that you're going to get better results squatting that deep, and I just have trouble getting somebody that deep, or there's pain, or if they just don't like it, then guess what? I'm probably not going to have that particular client squat that low. And I might work with them on it, but even if the evidence was conclusive, I need to be very aware of the personal when it comes to personal training. This is not, we only do the idealistic version of training, because that would be only having an ideal client. And an ideal client is somebody who just obeys what I say. And if I go and I do evidence-based, then I can just apply it to them and I don't pay attention, because I don't need to worry about what's going on with their hip, and if they have meniscus issues with their knee, and if they like or don't like something. But I do pay attention to those things because I am a personal trainer and I work with people. And so I want their feedback and I want to keep them coming back. And I can still get results with clients without necessarily saying, oh, this is the most perfect workout. You know what the best, most perfect workout is? The one that you keep showing up for. Your consistency is far more important than the optimization of what you do working out, especially if you only do it sporadically. I'd rather have somebody coming in being suboptimal and doing it regularly. Those people are going to get results. Now, if I can get them closer to optimal while also being consistent, that's a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing. So that is what we will pay attention to. Now let's talk just for a moment about the butt wink. And you know, I've done episodes on this, entire episodes of when somebody squats, when they go into that butt wink or the posterior pelvic tilt, and what really is the cause of that, why it is, and what it means. So I'm not going to go super in depth on all of this, but I am going to say this. A lot of times it can be limited range of motion. So it could be tight hamstrings. Could be part of it, could be weak erectors, that could be part of it. It could be it could be weakness in the hip flexors, and it could be tightness in the hip flexors. But what I know is that if I have an ideal squat depth, range of motion at my hip of 130 degrees, and that's limited. I need to go in and find out what is the limiting thing in a squat that is not allowing for that 130 degrees. Now, can I get more range of motion if I turn my knees out and I go wider with my hips? Yes, because the way that that ball and socket joint opens up the range of motion allows me to get more depth in that squat. So I can do that. But usually when I talk about 130 degrees of hip flexion, I'm talking about from that neutral position. If you're lying down on the table and I'm using my goniometer to measure range of motion at hip, I like 130 degrees. What's limiting that? So your hip flexion can be limited by your hip extensors. If there's also weakness in the lumbar spine, then the butt wink can happen earlier, especially when in a back squat where the spine is loaded forward, then the butt wink can happen. But we're looking at increasing range of motion and in hip flexion so that you get more hip extension going down into a squat. And I think that it's important to consider what that is for the butt wink. And so what I tell people is that if you get down into a squat and you're getting that range of motion that I'm asking of you, which is I like the thigh to be parallel, but the only way you can do that is going into the butt wink to get that range of motion. And for people who love the A to G squats, you're getting down even lower than thighs parallel to the ground. I'd say it's not necessarily wrong, but you certainly want to be very aware of the load that you're putting on somebody's back when you're going to that depth, because the hip, the butt wink, that posterior pelvic tilt that is taking place, in order to stand back up, you have to go back into a neutral position. So there is back extension, spinal extension taking place down at the pelvis to get back upright. And if you're loaded with that weight on you, you have to identify, is that okay for me to be doing spinal extension with that kind of weight? And so you got to be careful with that. So lighter weights, I'm actually okay with a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt getting down into the butt wink, but it's not ideal. So what is ideal? Ideal is this: full, available, pain-free range of motion without compensations. Full, available, pain-free range of motion without compensation. Now, if you say, well, I go into a posterior pelvic tilt, but I can squat all the way down without any weight. I go down into my squat position. I can kind of hang out there and eat my food if I wanted to. That's how I rest, is go into a deep squat position. Cool. Resting and doing that kind of stuff without being loaded externally is different than adding weight onto somebody. So I'm going to say be aware and be careful when it comes to that posterior pelvic tilt under load. We want to protect your back. You can get great outcomes when it comes to hypertrophy without going beyond what the hips can do and before going into that butt wink. So let's just stay doing what we can without the compensation. And then let's load it. Let's keep all the variables the same, but remember that full available pain-free range of motion without compensation is our goal. All right, so let's look at, again, we're going to go through and just kind of summarize things. Benefits of deep squats, well, possibly it increases muscle growth, possible enhanced muscle strength, possible improved athletic performance, but we have to consider that safety for some people. Some studies show that deep squats cause less pain and stiffness than partial squats. And I avoided deep squats for a very long time because I have knee pain. And it turns out that after I do a warm-up set, a deeper squat feels better on my knee than partial squats do. Now, there's a lot to be said for a lost decade of me not doing deeper squats because I was so concerned about hurting my knee. And then before I even knew the study, I was like, let me just practice my range of motion. And yeah, stiff getting into those deeper squats. But it turns out after the first set, loosen up pretty well, and it actually feels good on my knee. So I was so scared for so long being meniscus free. So I avoided those types of exercises, and now they're back, baby. And I'm getting some pretty good hypertrophy on the legs. I'll show them off one day. Don't worry, I'll show them off. So we can also look at you can have some higher specific muscle activation. You can increase strength in partial ranges of motion. So don't worry about doing partials, but also partials and depth can be good for certain individuals. So when it comes to squats, I think that there's a lot that we can focus on that give us different perspectives on our activities. A little more of a knee squatter, guess what? It's going to work your quads more. A little more of a forward bend, it's going to work your posterior chain more. A little more feet turning out and wider is going to be more for your adductors, and you'll get some glute medius and minimus activation in there. But the feet out and the knees out don't tend to have any difference on what your quads or your glutes look like when it comes to increases in muscle hypertrophy. All right, cool. Y'all, thanks for listening. Thank you to our producer, Eric Sorensen. I want you to like, subscribe, share, and leave a review. And if you want to reach out to me, do so. Hit me up on Instagram. It's dr.rickrichey. Or you can email me, rick.richey@nasm.org. Keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.